Ethan Walker had survived wars, ambushes, and nights so dark even seasoned seals whispered prayers into their sleeves. But nothing prepared him for the moment. A half-burned scrap of his brother's flannel shirt fell from the jaws of a terrified German shepherd at his doorstep. The storm that night was vicious, the kind that swallowed sound and bent trees. But Ethan knew danger didn't always come wearing boots or carrying rifles. Sometimes it crawled out of the woods, limping, shaking, wearing a collar that shouldn't exist, one designed for military tracking. As the dog collapsed on his porch, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. The unmistakable pull of a threat closing in. And he was right. That single moment would drag him into a deadly conspiracy of poisoned rivers, corporate hunters, and a man named Victor Hale, someone who'd burn an entire valley just to hide the truth. Before we begin this journey, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Or simply type Amen for Ethan, Daniel, and every soul who ever fought for justice they might never see. The first snowstorm of the season always came early to Pine Ridge, a quiet Montana town tucked between mountains and long-forgotten logging roads. On nights like this, the wind didn't just blow. It howled, bending the treetops and sweeping waves of sharp, icy air across the valley. And tucked deep inside those woods, beneath the silhouette of towering Douglas firs, stood a weather-beaten cabin whose chimney puffed only the faintest trace of smoke. Inside lived Ethan Walker. To most people in Pine Ridge, Ethan was a ghost, someone they saw only at the feed store twice a month, buying canned goods and dog food out of habit rather than companionship. He was 68 now, tall but slightly stooped, with the kind of broad shoulders that once belonged to a soldier but had long since begun to sag from years of carrying things heavier than packs or weapons. His hair, once coal-black, had turned silver at the temples. His beard was short but rough, dotted with white. His face was angular, carved by cold weather and long silences, the lines around his eyes deepening ever since the fire 3 months ago, the fire that took his younger brother, Daniel. Ethan sat in his old recliner by the window, nursing a mug of black coffee that had long gone cold. His hands were calloused, the knuckles swollen from age and old breaks. On the table beside him lay a flannel shirt, red and navy plaid, frayed at the elbows, the last thing he ever kept from Daniel's belongings. Some nights he stared at it as if waiting for it to rise up and explain itself. Why Daniel called the night of the fire. Why Ethan let the call ring. Why the sheriff said it was an accident, when Ethan's instincts, those sharpened during 2 decades as a Navy SEAL, told him otherwise. He hadn't slept a full night since. Outside, the storm beat mercilessly against the window pane. Snow slapped the glass, and the trees groaned under the weight of wet ice. Ethan was about to get up to throw another log in the stove when a faint movement at the edge of the clearing caught his eye. Something staggered between the dark tree trunks. At first he thought it was a deer, limping, maybe injured from hunters. But as it stumbled forward into the weak light spilling from the porch, the shape shifted into something smaller. And then it collapsed. Ethan's breath caught, not out of fear, but recognition. A German shepherd puppy, no more than 6 or 7 months old. Its fur was a rare silver gray, matted with mud and streaked with blood along one hind leg. Snow clung to its coat, forming tiny white beads on the tips of its ears. Even from across the yard, Ethan could see the sharp rise and fall of its chest. Rapid, frantic. He had seen that look before. The look of an animal running from something it shouldn't have survived. He set his mug aside, grabbed his coat, and pushed open the cabin door. The cold hit him like a slap. The wind sliced across his cheeks, whipping his beard sideways, but he trudged forward anyway, boots sinking deep into the mixture of mud and early snow. As he approached, the pup tried to lift its head, but its strength gave out. Its jaws loosened for a moment, and that was when Ethan saw it. A piece of fabric, burnt along the edges and blackened by soot. He crouched down, heart pounding harder than it had in years. Carefully, he took the cloth from the dog's mouth and turned it toward the porch light. Red and navy plaid, the same pattern as Daniel's shirt, his shirt. The same pattern Ethan had folded into a box 3 months ago after the investigators told him nothing could be salvaged from the fire. "Where'd you get this?" Ethan whispered. The pup flinched at the sound of his voice but didn't pull away. He reached out slowly, letting the pup sniff his glove. Its eyes were amber, wide, frightened, but not wild. More like it was pleading. "Trust me. Help me. Don't leave me out here." Ethan scooped the animal into his arms. It weighed almost nothing, too little for its size. He held it close to his chest, shielding it from the wind, and hurried back toward the cabin. Snowflakes melted instantly on the dog's overheated fur. "Easy," he muttered. "You're safe now." Inside, the warmth of the stove wrapped around them. Ethan laid the pup on a folded blanket near the fire, then grabbed a damp towel to clean its muzzle. That was when he noticed it. A collar. Thick, dark leather. Too new, too tight, too intentional. When he tried to slip it off, it didn't budge. Ethan ran his fingers around the seam. There wasn't one. No buckle, no snap, no clasp. Instead, a small metal port, smooth, rectangular, embedded seamlessly along the underside. Ethan froze. He had seen collars like this before. Not on pets. On K-9 units used in reconnaissance operations, specifically models with encrypted tracking chips. Expensive. Restricted. Not something any rancher in Pine Ridge would have lying around. His stomach tightened. Someone had put this on the pup. Someone who had access to high-grade tracking tech. Someone who wanted the puppy to be found. Not by just anyone, but by him. Ethan reached for his knife and gently pried at the edge of the port. The dog whimpered, legs twitching, eyes squeezing shut. Ethan stopped immediately. "Sorry, buddy," he murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you." He leaned closer until he was almost nose to nose with the animal. "But somebody sure wanted you to hurt me." The pup exhaled shakily and pressed its forehead into Ethan's wrist. Not affection, but desperation. Ethan recognized it because he had once done the same. Huddled in a desert bunker waiting for extraction, hoping someone stronger, wiser, or simply alive would make a decision that saved them both. He wrapped the blanket tighter around the dog, then lifted the charred piece of flannel again. Snowmelt had dampened the edges, but the pattern was unmistakable. Daniel never went anywhere in autumn without that shirt. He had worn it the day before the fire. Something cold slid into Ethan's spine, a feeling he hadn't experienced since combat. Someone was sending him a message. A faint beep crackled through the cabin. Ethan stiffened. It came from the collar. Just one beep, soft, quick, but enough to confirm exactly what he feared. The tracking device wasn't dormant. Someone, somewhere, had just pinged its location, and now they knew exactly where Ethan Walker was. Ethan Walker barely slept that night. Every time the cabin creaked or the wind pressed hard against the window, he half expected figures in dark coats to appear in the tree line. The small German shepherd puppy lay curled beside the wood stove, wrapped in the old wool blanket Ethan kept for harsh winters. Its breathing had steadied, though its left hind leg twitched occasionally, as if reliving whatever nightmare had chased it through the storm. By dawn, the blizzard had settled into a soft drift of powder that covered everything outside in a muted white. Ethan knelt beside the puppy, watching the way its fur, silver gray with streaks of charcoal, caught the flickering firelight. "You need a name," he muttered. The dog cracked an eye open at the sound of his voice. "Ranger," Ethan decided. That's what Daniel used to call his unit buddies. Maybe he'd like that. Ranger responded with a small, hoarse huff that wasn't quite a bark, but close enough that it made Ethan's chest tighten unexpectedly. He scratched behind the dog's ear, feeling the slight flinch from pain, but also the trust beginning to take root. The collar was still there, impossibly tight, impossible to remove. But Ethan would deal with that once he understood who wanted the dog tracked. After a quick breakfast of reheated biscuits and jerky, Ethan layered up in his heavy parka, thick boots and wool gloves. He wrapped Ranger in a dry blanket and lifted him gently, but the dog wriggled, turned, and limped toward the door instead. The puppy's determination surprised him. "You want to go somewhere?" Ethan murmured. "Show me something?" Ranger pushed his snout against the doorframe, leaving a smear of soot behind. Ethan hesitated. The storm had left uneven drifts and hidden ice patches, but something about the pup's urgency reminded him of patrol dogs he'd worked with overseas, animals that never wasted energy unless the message mattered. "All right then," he said, opening the door. "Lead the way." The cold hit instantly, sharp and biting. Ranger limped through the snow, stopping occasionally to sniff the wind, his ears pinned back but alert. Ethan followed close behind, scanning the forest with automatic precision, his breath forming white clouds in front of him. The trail descended along the ridge and curved toward a clearing Ethan hadn't visited since autumn, a clearing that held the charred remains of Daniel's homestead. Ranger paused at the tree line, trembling, not from the cold, but from memory. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on the dog's shoulder. "It's all right. I'm here." They stepped out into the clearing. The sight hit Ethan like a hammer. 3 months had passed, yet the fire's scars still lay raw on the land. The cabin Daniel once lived in, small, sturdy, always smelling faintly of coffee and sawdust, was nothing more than a blackened skeleton. The stone chimney stood crooked, surrounded by collapsed beams, melted tools, and warped sheets of corrugated metal. Snow had settled across the ruins in curved white mounds, making the scene feel eerily peaceful, as if the land had attempted to bury the violence beneath a blanket of winter silence. Ranger sniffed along the remains, weaving between broken planks and charred furniture legs. Ethan kept his distance, staring at the spot where the sheriff had once stood, and told him, it was a simple accident. But Ethan had spent a lifetime studying explosions, structural collapses, and the strange ways fire behaved. This wasn't simple. And now, with Ranger leading him here, he knew for certain Daniel had been trying to tell him something before he died. The dog barked, short, sharp, then limped toward the old pine tree behind what used to be the barn. The tree was massive, easily 60 years old, with bark so thick it formed deep grooves like armor. Ranger nosed at the soil, then began digging frantically with his uninjured paw. Ethan hurried over. "Easy, buddy. Let me help." He knelt in the snow and brushed away the loose dirt. Something metal glinted beneath the surface. He pushed aside more soil until a steel handle emerged. A military-grade ammunition box, the kind built to survive rain, fire, even short-term submersion. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He pulled the box free. Despite the burnt clearing around them, the canister was intact. Ethan unlatched the heavy clasp, lifted the lid, and stared. Inside were 3 sealed plastic bags containing murky water samples labeled with dates, a spiral-bound notebook, and a thin stack of printed emails, edges crisp, protected from damage. He lifted the notebook first. The handwriting was familiar, neat, deliberate, a little cramped. Daniel. Ethan read the first page, and the ice beneath his boots suddenly felt like it had cracked. North Star Development is dumping chemicals into the watershed. The creek is dying. I've reported it twice. No response. Third time, someone threatened me. He flipped to another entry. Test results show benzene and arsenic levels too high to ignore. Sent copies to State Lab. They came back altered. Someone is intercepting the reports. Then another. Someone was outside last night. Didn't see their face. Heard boots on gravel. I think they want the land. If anything happens to me, I hope Ethan forgives me for everything. He always understood danger better than me. Ethan closed his eyes. The wind moaned through the tree branches, almost like a voice caught between breath and regret. Ranger nudged his leg. Ethan reached down, resting his gloved hand atop the dog's head. He needed me, Ethan said quietly, and I didn't pick up the phone. The dog leaned against him, warm and trembling. Ethan returned to the box and lifted the printed emails. The sender was listed as K. Hale at North Star Developments, com, and the tone was unmistakable. Thinly veiled threats. Warnings to stay out of company matters. One even referenced fire insurance. It was enough evidence to expose North Star. Enough to show what Daniel had died for. A soft beep broke the silence. Ethan looked down. The sound hadn't come from the box. It came from Ranger's collar. The puppy flattened against the ground, whining. Ethan realized the truth in an instant. The tracker wasn't meant to monitor the dog. It was meant to monitor whoever found the evidence Daniel hid. The moment Ethan opened the box, the device probably transmitted its location. Ethan stood slowly, turning toward the tree line, scanning the shadows where the forest grew thick and dark again. Ranger pressed against his leg, shivering, not from fear of the cold, but from something else. Something Ethan felt too. They were no longer alone in the clearing. The drone came in low from the north, a faint electronic whine that didn't belong to the wind or the birds or anything that should have been in those hills. Ethan heard it before he saw it. A high, insect-like buzz cutting through the still, cold air above the ruins of Daniel's place. He snapped the ammo box shut on instinct and crouched beside the old pine, one hand closing around Ranger's collar. "Down," he whispered. The puppy dropped immediately, belly pressed to the snow, ears pinned flat, amber eyes locked on the sky. Ethan squinted up through the branches. The drone was sleek and white, its arms tipped with spinning rotors that flickered in the winter light. A small red LED blinked on its underside in a steady, clinical rhythm. It hovered above the blackened chimney like an eye that had finally found its target. Ethan didn't need a manual to know what that red blink meant. Camera live. Transmitter sending. Somebody, somewhere, was watching him kneel on ground that should have stayed a crime scene. Somebody had just confirmed he'd found what they failed to burn. He thought of the emails in the box, the signature at the bottom of the threats. K. Hale, North Star Development. The name had scratched at his memory when he'd read it. Now it clicked. Victor Hale. 15 years ago, Ethan had heard that name on a different kind of radio. Hale had been a contractor then, working for a private security company in the Middle East. The kind of man who turned war into a business. Rumors said he enjoyed his work a little too much. Men like that didn't retire quietly into real estate security. They graduated to it. Ethan kept his voice low. "Well, Victor, I guess you want to say hello." The drone shifted, adjusting its position, as if answering him with a tilt of its mechanical head. Ranger whined, a thin, high sound that trembled with something deeper than ordinary fear. The bright February sky meant shooting it down with a rifle would only prove he'd seen it. And whoever was on the other end of the signal would know he understood what they were doing. For now, he needed these people to underestimate him. Let them think he was just an old man poking around his brother's ashes. He slid the ammo box under a crust of snow and debris at the base of the pine, covering it with burnt boards and loose earth. "We're not carrying this target any farther than we have to," he murmured. "We come back for it." Ranger licked his hand, then flinched as the drone dropped lower, rotors humming louder now. Ethan felt the familiar burn of adrenaline in his veins. 68 or not, the switch inside him was still there. The one that turned an aging widower into a man who'd survived ambushes on 3 continents. He wrapped his fingers tighter in Ranger's fur. "We move," he said. "Now." They slipped into the tree line, cutting a diagonal route away from the clearing. Ethan kept to the low ground, letting the fir branches swallow them. Snow crunched under his boots, but he placed each step carefully, rolling from heel to toe on the patches of exposed dirt where the wind had scoured the ground bare. Above the trees, the drone tracked them for a few seconds, then drifted back toward the ruins like a vulture circling a carcass. Good. Let them look where he wasn't. By the time Ethan reached the narrow ravine that split the hillside, the light was already beginning to change, the pale winter sun sliding behind a bank of clouds. Ranger limped ahead, nose close to the ground, following some scent trail Ethan couldn't sense but trusted anyway. Branches snagged the hem of Ethan's coat. His knees protested every downhill step. Old shrapnel in his left thigh flared with heat, a souvenir from a mission decades ago. "You picked a fine time to come visit, Daniel," he muttered under his breath. A crack echoed through the forest. Not thunder, not wood. A rifle shot, distant but sharp enough to flatten the air around it for a heartbeat. Ranger froze. Ethan dropped behind a fallen log in one fluid motion, pulling the dog down with him. His pulse hammered in his ears, but his breathing stayed steady. He counted silently. 1, 2, 3. Another shot, farther to the west. A signal more than a kill attempt. They were closing the circle, pushing him toward a choke point. He'd done the same thing to enemy fighters more times than he could admit. "They're hunting us," he whispered. Ranger's fur bristled under his hand. The pup's chest heaved faster, breath turning ragged. Ethan felt a tremor ripple through the dog's body, from the collar down to his paws, as if some memory had been yanked awake. "Easy, kid," Ethan said, letting his voice drop to the calm, level tone he used to use on panicked rookies in the field. "Stay with me." The ravine deepened ahead, the slope dropping into a narrow creek bed choked with ice and dark water. Miller Creek. In summer, it was barely ankle deep. Today, swollen with melt and storm runoff, it had transformed into a fast, angry ribbon that sliced through the hills. They'd have to cross it if they wanted to reach the backside of Ethan's land without hitting the road, where Hale's men would be waiting. He slid down the bank, boots digging into the mud. The roar of the water grew louder, stealing the warmth from the air. Ranger stopped at the edge, nails clawing at the wet stone. His whole body shook now, not from the cold, but from something else. The whites of his eyes showed as he stared at the surge, chest stuttering. Ethan recognized that look instantly. He had seen it in the eyes of men under mortar fire, in the mirror on the 4th of July, in the eyes of his own brother when someone mentioned their father's temper. This wasn't ordinary fear. This was a memory with teeth. "You were there, weren't you?" Ethan said softly. "In the fire, in the water. You remember both." Ranger dropped into a crouch, trying to crawl away from the bank, whimpering as the sound of the rushing creek blended with some other roar only he could hear. Above them, another gunshot cracked, closer this time. Bark exploded from a tree trunk 15 yards uphill, showering them in splinters. That one wasn't a signal. That was a warning. "We see you. Don't make us aim lower." Ethan made his choice. "We don't have the luxury of staying scared," he said. "Not today." He jammed the toe of his boot into a crevice in the rock, testing the depth of the water with a broken branch. It hit solid ground at about mid-thigh. Fast, but not unstoppable. "Ranger," he ordered, tightening his grip on the pup's collar. "With me." His boots plunged into the creek. The cold bit through the leather and straight into the bone, sending needles of pain up his legs. The current slammed into him, trying to twist his feet out from under him, but he leaned into it, body angled like he was pushing through a wall. Behind him, Ranger hesitated on the bank, twitching backward. Another bullet snapped into the far shore, sending up a spurt of wet earth. The pup flinched forward, choosing Ethan's terror over his own. He leaped, landing beside Ethan with a splash, immediately swept sideways by the force of the water. The collar jerked hard in Ethan's hand, almost pulling him off balance. For a long, lurching second, the world narrowed to cold and noise and weight. Ethan's bad knee slipped. His foot skidded off the rock, and he dropped to one side, the current slamming into his chest. He went down. Water closed over his head. Everything turned dark and roaring and wild. For a heartbeat, he was back in a flooded culvert in Kandahar, trapped under debris, lungs burning. Hands, younger and stronger, had dragged him out then. Nobody was here now except... Teeth clamped down on his sleeve. Not hard enough to break skin, but hard enough to hurt. Ethan felt the sharp tug against the current, insistent and furious. Ranger kicked against his side, paddling upstream, refusing to let go. Ethan's training snapped back in place. He rolled with the pull, found the creek bed with his knee again, shoved himself upright, and lunged toward the bank. Together they stumbled onto the far shore, collapsing in a tangle of wet fur and dripping gear. Ethan lay there for a few seconds, chest heaving, the sky spinning overhead. Ranger pressed against him, panting, sides heaving, eyes still too wide, but they were alive. "You and I," Ethan wheezed, pushing wet hair back from his face, "are going to have a long talk about what constitutes a rescue." Ranger licked the water from his cheek, then froze, ears snapping forward. Ethan heard it too, an engine, low and grinding, somewhere on the service road to the east, another to the south. They'd crossed the creek, but Hale's men were tightening the net. Moving through the trees now would be like walking across a lit stage. They needed cover. Better yet, they needed information. A voice cut through the woods behind them, sharp and female. "Walker!" Ethan spun, dropping automatically into a half-crouch, his hand going to the pistol at his hip. A figure stepped from behind a cluster of firs, hands raised to show they were empty. She was in her mid-30s, maybe a bit older, with a lean, wiry build that came from hours on uneven ground rather than any gym. Her dark brown hair was braided tight and tucked under a forest green beanie. A wind-burned face, sharp cheekbones, a few faint freckles across the nose. Her eyes were a clear, steady hazel, the kind of eyes that learned to catalog details and never forgot them. She wore a tan ranger jacket with the state forestry badge on the shoulder, dark hiking pants, and mud-stained boots that had clearly seen every inch of these hills. A pair of binoculars hung from her neck, and a sidearm rode at her hip, holstered but not forgotten. "Ethan," she said, voice low but urgent. "It's Sarah Collins, District Ranger." The name clicked. He'd seen her once at the town hall months ago, standing at the back during the meeting about North Star's eco-resort, arms crossed, jaw tight, the only one asking questions the developers didn't want to answer. Back then, he'd written her off as another idealist who would eventually get tired of fighting city lawyers. Maybe he'd been wrong. "You picked a hell of a time for a hike, Ranger Collins," he said. "I've been watching that property since your brother's fire," she replied. "And I watched your friend's drone, the one above the ruins, change direction when you dug something up. Then I heard the shots." Her gaze flicked to the collar around Ranger's neck, to the way the dog flinched at the gunfire echoing faintly through the woods. Concern hardened her features. "They're not going to let you walk out of here." "That your professional opinion?" Ethan asked. "That's my professional experience," she shot back. "North Star has been pushing this valley for 2 years. Water tests go missing. Lab techs suddenly get transferred. People who complain about headaches and rashes stop returning my calls. Your brother was the only one stubborn enough to write everything down. Now they know you have what he couldn't get out." Ethan studied her for a beat, weighing the set of her shoulders, the steady way she met his eyes, the lack of panic in her voice. There was fear there. Only a fool wouldn't be scared, but it rode under discipline, not over it. Behind his leg, Ranger sniffed the air around her, then stepped half a pace closer, tail low but wagging once. Ethan trusted that more than any badge. "So what's your play, Collins?" he asked. "You gonna call the sheriff and ask him to send a strongly worded letter?" One corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Cell service is dead on this side of the ridge, and your sheriff thinks North Star is going to save the tax base. I'm not calling anyone. I'm getting you out." She jerked her chin toward the north, where the trees grew denser and the ground rose steeply. "There's an old fire road they don't know about. Runs behind the ridge line. My truck's parked a mile up. If we stay low, we can slip past their perimeter and get you and whatever you found to someone who'll actually do something." Another shot cracked in the distance, this one answered by a second from a different angle. The air between the three of them tightened. "And if we don't move?" Ethan asked. "Then Victor Hale gets what he wants," Sarah said simply. "Your brother stays the crazy farmer who fell asleep with a lantern, and you disappear in a hiking accident." She stepped closer, dropping her voice to a near whisper. "You want to die in these woods, Mr. Walker? Or do you want to make sure he doesn't?" Ethan looked down at Ranger. The pup was watching him, head tilted, as if he understood every word. Snow clung to his whiskers, his chest still heaving from the river, but the tremor in his legs had turned into a coiled readiness. Waiting for Ethan's call, waiting for the mission. Ethan nodded once. "Lead the way." Sarah turned, cutting into the trees with the easy, ground-eating stride of someone who knew how to move fast without being seen. Ethan fell in behind her, Ranger at his side. The forest swallowed them, the sound of engines growing faint behind the thick curtain of pines. For a few minutes, all that existed was breath and snow and the crunch of their boots. Then, just as the slope began to level out, a new sound crawled under the wind. The low, unmistakable growl of a diesel engine idling somewhere ahead of them, exactly where the ridge should have been empty. Sarah stopped so suddenly Ethan almost ran into her. She turned her head slowly, eyes narrowing as she listened. "That," she whispered, "is not my truck." Snow still clung to their boots when Ethan, Sarah, and Ranger finally reached the back trail leading to his cabin. The slope was steep, forcing them into a silent climb that burned Ethan's lungs and aggravated the old shrapnel buried in his thigh. Ranger kept close to his heel, tail low, ears scanning every rustle of wind. Sarah moved ahead with the sure-footed precision of someone bred in the mountains, her wiry frame absorbing the terrain's punishment without slowing. Her face, reddened by cold and streaked with sweat, remained sharply focused, though Ethan could see tension coiled in her jaw. She knew, as he did, that time was no longer on their side. The sun had dipped low behind the ridge by the time they reached the cabin. What little daylight remained cast the clearing in a pale, icy blue. The structure itself sat half-buried under snowdrifts, smoke from the earlier fire still lingering in the chimney. Ethan paused at the threshold, taking in the quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no snapping branches, no wind chimes he had hung last summer on the cedar post. "They're close," Sarah murmured behind him. Ethan nodded. "They want to end this tonight." Inside, they moved quickly. Ethan secured the doors, checked the rifle cabinet, and pulled out a shotgun older than Sarah but clean and ready. Ranger paced the floor in tight circles, his nails tapping anxiously on the wood. Every now and then he stopped to stare at the boarded window as if expecting something to burst through it. Sarah shrugged off her jacket, revealing the dark green Ranger uniform beneath. Her shoulders were squared, her posture tense. "If Hale's involved," she said, "he'll force a confrontation. He's not the type to play defense." "You know him?" Ethan asked. "Only by reputation." She tightened her ponytail. "He worked a contract for the Federal Wildfire Division 15 years ago. Rumor said he nearly got a whole crew killed, then lied about the report. Men with that history don't suddenly grow ethics." Ethan loaded shells into the shotgun. "And now he's head of security for North Star." "And armed," Sarah said. "Armed and desperate." A sudden click echoed through the cabin. The lights flickered, dimmed, then went out entirely. The refrigerator hummed once, sighed, and died. Ranger froze. A long, low whine escaped from his throat. Ethan's stomach dropped. "They cut the power." Sarah moved to the window, lifted a corner of the blackout curtain, and peered outside. Her breath tightened. "They cut everything. I don't see any lights from town either." "Grid's down," Ethan said. "They isolated the whole ridge." As if answering him, a voice boomed from outside, deep, amplified, cruelly calm. "Walker!" Ranger scrambled backward, tail between his legs, hackles raised. Ethan stepped closer to the window. Another call echoed through the clearing. "Ethan Walker, you have something that belongs to us." Sarah stiffened. "Hale." The third call came, clear and unhurried, as if the man had all the time in the world. "Bring out the evidence, or we'll burn down everything inside with you in it." A cold certainty settled in Ethan's gut. This had been their plan all along. Replicate Daniel's death, Erase the problem by fire. Sarah grabbed the small emergency radio from her belt, turning the dial to a coded channel. "I made contact with a federal unit last week," she whispered. "I had a feeling North Star would escalate." Ethan glanced at her. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't know if you'd still be alive by the time they listened," she answered. Before he could reply, a glass bottle shattered on the side of the cabin, flames licking upward as liquid fire spread across the wood siding. Another bottle broke on the opposite wall, and then another. Ranger bolted under the table, trembling violently. Ethan felt his body curl inward, as if suffering through a memory etched into the dog's bones. The fire climbed fast, too fast, fueled by accelerants designed to engulf structures in minutes. Black smoke seeped through the cracks of the door. Ethan covered his mouth with his sleeve. "They're setting a perimeter," he said. "They want to trap us in one room before they finish it." Sarah coughed, waving away smoke. "We have to move now, before the roof gives." But Ranger wasn't moving. His eyes had gone far away, pupils dilated as if trapped again inside Daniel's burning house. His whole body shook. "Ranger!" Ethan raised his voice above the roar outside. "Stay with me, kid. Look at me." The dog didn't respond. Another firebomb hit the back wall, and flames raced across the roof beams. Smoke thickened, swirling into the living room. Sarah grabbed Ethan's arm. "We don't have time!" A wooden beam cracked overhead. The ceiling sagged. "Go!" Ethan barked. "Get out, now!" Sarah shoved the emergency radio into her coat and sprinted toward the back door. Ethan grabbed Ranger, pulling him from beneath the table, but the dog resisted, legs stiff, muscles frozen with trauma. The smoke grew suffocating. Ethan's eyes burned. His lungs seized. His grip loosened. He dropped to one knee, coughing so violently he nearly blacked out. Ranger suddenly snapped awake, something in Ethan's collapse breaking through his paralysis. The pup lunged forward, teeth gripping Ethan's coat collar. He pulled with everything he had, dragging the old man inch by inch across the floor. Ethan tried to stand, but his knees buckled, the world spinning. Through the haze he saw Ranger's eyes, wide, terrified, but determined. The dog tugged harder, whimpering, pulling Ethan toward the cracked back door where Sarah was waiting, shouting something he couldn't hear over the roar of the fire. A beam fell behind them with a thunderous crash. Heat washed over Ethan's back like an open furnace. Ranger gave one final heave, and Ethan tumbled through the doorway onto the snow outside. Cold air hit him like a shock of electricity. He gasped, coughing violently, blinking smoke from his eyes. Ranger collapsed beside him, sides heaving. Sarah knelt next to them, her face streaked with soot. "We have to move," she said. "Hail's coming." As if summoned, boots crunched on the frozen ground. A tall figure stepped out of the dark, the glow of the burning cabin outlining his silhouette. Victor Hale. He was in his early 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a square jaw dusted in dark stubble and eyes cold as stone. His hair was silver at the temples, slicked back with military precision. His presence radiated the calm menace of a man who had spent years giving orders in places where mercy didn't exist. And he carried a pistol with the confidence of someone who'd used one many times before. He leveled the gun at Ethan's chest. "You should have stayed quiet, old man." Sarah's hand shot toward her radio. She pressed the emergency trigger. A burst of static. Then, from somewhere beyond the tree line, a shout. Then another. Boots, lights, dozens. Hale's jaw clenched. He cocked the pistol. Too late. He pulled the trigger, and the forest exploded with voices yelling, "Federal agents, drop your weapon!" cut to black. The forest was still echoing with the shouts of federal agents when Victor Hale finally lowered his weapon. He didn't do it out of fear. Men like him didn't fear consequences. They feared losing control. But with a dozen tactical lights pinned on his chest and another squad circling behind him through the burning haze of Ethan's collapsing cabin, even Hale understood that his game had ended. His square jaw tightened beneath a layer of dark stubble, and his cold, gray eyes flicked over to Ethan, as if accusing him of breaking rules Hale himself had written. Two agents, both in dark winter tactical gear, their badges glinting beneath headlamps, rushed forward. The first was Agent Brooks, a tall African-American man in his 40s with a shaved head, firm posture, and a calm, commanding tone sharpened from years of handling high-risk arrests. The second was Agent Ramirez, a Latina in her late 30s with a compact, athletic build, sharp cheekbones, and an expression that read every threat in a room before it even breathed. They disarmed Hale, cuffed him, and pulled him back as he snarled something about unfinished business, though no one cared enough to listen. Behind them, more agents swept the perimeter, detaining 3 armed men who had tried, and failed, to retreat into the dark woods. All were rugged, military-cut types in their late 30s or 40s, sporting heavy coats and tactical boots. Their expressions held the hollow look of men who had followed the wrong leader for too long. One had a scar slicing across his cheek. Another had knuckles bruised from recent violence. None dared look Ethan in the eye. When it was finally safe, Sarah stepped toward Ethan and Ranger. Her hazel eyes softened for the first time that night. Her face, soot-streaked, wind-burned, with strands of dark brown hair falling loose from her braid, looked exhausted but unbroken. "You two all right?" she asked, voice hoarse from smoke. Ethan coughed, then nodded. "We're breathing. That's a start." Ranger pressed against his leg, tail barely moving, still shaken but refusing to leave Ethan's side. Snow clung to his silver-gray fur, and soot stained the lighter patches along his chest. He looked older than the weeks Ethan had known him. Trauma had a way of aging anything it touched. But the dog lifted his head proudly when Agent Brooks knelt to pet him. "That's one brave pup," Brooks said. "He dragged you out of a fully involved structure?" Sarah answered for Ethan. "He saved his life, without hesitation." The agent scratched behind Ranger's ear, admiration flickering across his face. "Then I'd say we have a 4th hero at this crime scene." Over the next days, the mountain ridge transformed from a battlefield back into a working investigation zone. Federal vehicles replaced Hale's men. Scientists in insulated jackets tested the streams and reservoirs. Lawyers, auditors, and investigators spread across North Star development like wildfire. What they found unraveled the entire company. Falsified water reports, bribed officials, toxins secretly dumped into the watershed, and internal memos signed by Victor Hale himself, authorizing pressure strategies to force local landowners to sell. The town of Pine Ridge watched the news unfold with a mixture of horror and vindication. Families who had suffered unexplained sickness finally understood why. Farmers who had resisted selling their land now knew how narrowly they'd escaped disaster. Daniel's death was reclassified within a week, not an accident, but homicide tied directly to North Star. For the first time in months, Ethan slept without waking, gasping from guilt. In early spring, when the snow began melting into the soil and the pines resumed their deep green color, Ethan stood outside a newly built cabin on a small ridge overlooking the valley. It wasn't fancy, just sturdy timber walls, a metal roof, and a stone chimney, but it felt like home, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for decades. Ranger lay stretched across the porch, his fur catching the warm sunlight. His leg had healed, though he still carried the occasional limp, a reminder of what he had survived. Sarah visited often. Some mornings she wore her ranger uniform. Other days she appeared in jeans, a flannel shirt, and a mug of black coffee in hand. She had become not just an ally, but something Ethan hadn't had since his military days, someone who understood the weight he carried. She was tall and lean, her posture always straight, with a kind of quiet confidence in the way she walked through the forest, as if nothing in the hills could surprise her anymore. She checked on Ranger's progress, argued with Ethan about whether he should see a doctor for his smoke inhalation. He refused, and slowly coaxed him into reconnecting with the townspeople he had long pushed away. "You know," she said one afternoon while sitting on the porch rail, "a lot of people want to thank you. You saved this valley." Ethan shook his head. "Daniel saved it. I just finished what he started." Ranger lifted his head, ears perked, as if agreeing. Later that week, when the spring sun finally warmed the ridge enough to melt the last patches of snow, Ethan hiked with Ranger to the place Daniel had always called the High Shoulder, a quiet hilltop overlooking acres of pine forest rolling into the horizon. Ethan carried two things in his pack: Daniel's journal and the collar that had nearly gotten them both killed. At the crest, he sat on a flat boulder. Ranger curled beside him, pressing his head onto Ethan's knee. The sky was a brilliant blue, the air fresh with the scent of new pine sap. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's head and whispered, "He didn't die in vain, Dan. I brought it all to light, just like you tried to." The wind shifted softly, brushing his face like an answer. Ranger exhaled and nudged the journal closer to Ethan's hand, as if urging him to read it again, not out of pain this time, but remembrance. Ethan closed his eyes. The valley was safe. The truth had won. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. The story ended not with fire, but with healing. Not with loss, but with justice. Not with silence, but with a dog's steady breathing against his knee, quiet, loyal, and whole.